All right, everybody, here we go. Last new stuff to add for non-harmonic tones. And the beauty here is that we're not really adding new stuff. We're just sort of expanding something we already know about. And in this case, we're going to expand our understanding of suspensions, all right? So we've looked at suspensions already, and we know about the 4-3 suspension and the 7-6 suspension. Let's now add the 2-3 suspension, all right? So something should already be jumping out at you about the 2-3 suspension because we've talked about the 4-3 and the 7-6. And what's different about 2-3 compared to those should stand out that the numbers, for whatever reason, are getting bigger, right? When we've talked about the 4-3, forgot I was on the Wurlitzer there. We've got the fourth resolving down to the third with the 7-6. Seventh resolving downwards to the sixth. 2-3, okay, is it going upwards? What's the deal? Well, the deal is that the 2-3 suspension is the only one that is going to happen in the bass voice. And so because of that, the numbers in the naming and the intervals that reflects are going to get bigger because the note in the bass, as it resolves downwards, is going to be moving away from the upper voices. We'll illustrate that in a second. But a couple of things to point out. We sort of, when we were talking about the 4-3 and the 7-6, I may have made a joke about, it's sad the basses don't get to participate, but the basses get their very, very own suspension, and it's the 2-3 suspension. So there really is only this one option for the basses. So if you're analyzing a piece of music, for instance, and you see a clear-cut suspension in the bass, and you're thinking, oh, now I have to get in there and analyze it. The counting of the numbers thing is always really complicated. Stop right there, because if it's in the bass voice, if it's in the lowest voice, it's a 2-3 suspension every time. You cannot have a 4-3 suspension in the bass. It doesn't happen. A 7-6, you can't have those in the bass. They don't work. It is impossible to do it because those are really predicated on being a fourth above something. And if your bass is a fourth above something, I got news for you. You have a new bass, right? So you got to watch out for that. So you could have, like if you're here, if you think you're playing bass right there, you might think that you're doing great things, but all of a sudden, if you realize that there's somebody like doing this, I got news for you. You got a new bass. Okay. So the numbers get bigger because the note resolves away from the upper voices. What the crap does that mean? Well, let's look at some music to figure it out. Here we go. We're in B flat. We've got 1 to a 5-6 chord. That's nice, right? So let's look at the bass line here, and let's see what is it about this bass line that means we can put a suspension here. Well, as with all suspensions, even though this one's unique, the numbers get bigger, it's in the bass, all that stuff. As with all suspensions, it's going to be an ornamentation of downwards motion of a second, right? The directionality really, really, really matters. So if we look at these other voices, the sopranos, for instance, they move by a second. They go from B flat to C, but that they cannot do a suspension because it's moving upwards, not downwards. The sopranos here, for instance, could do an appoggiatura because appoggiaturas work on upwards motion by a second. The alto voice here, staying on the same note, they could do a neighbor tone, right? Now, the tenors are doing a downwards second, so theoretically we could do a suspension there, but we want to get the basses into the fun here. So the basses move from B flat to A. That's downwards motion of a second. So we can put a suspension there, and let's look at what happens if we do. So we can see we've got the trademark sign of a suspension, the tie, and still the basses only have two different notes. They've got B flat, still moving to A. But remember, as with all suspensions, the preparation and the suspension, the dissonant note, are the same note, right? So we've got preparation, the original note, which is suspended, this is the suspension, into the next chord. And you can hopefully see really clearly the dissonance that it creates from B flat to C, right? That then resolves downwards to the resolution. So preparation, suspension, resolution, right? Even though there are only two different notes, there are three roles being filled. Does that kind of make sense? That's kind of a weird way to think of it, but that might help a little bit. Two different notes, three roles or three jobs, right? So, okay. Now, you may have already noticed why we're calling this a 2-3 suspension. And to do this, we don't even need to worry right now about the soprano and alto voices. I know, especially for the sopranos, that's a hard sentence to hear. We don't need to worry about you. I promise, we are worried about you, sopranos. We're very worried. We're just going to pretend we're not right now. So, if we look here at the bass and tenor voices, they start on this lovely third. And if we go back to the original one over here, we've got lovely motion in thirds, third, da, 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 da. Nice. However, since we suspend the B flat, when the tenor line moves from D down to C, what interval do we end up with because of this suspension? We get a second, right? B flat to C is a second. B flat in the basses, C in the tenors. So if that's the bass, right? The suspension makes it a second. And then where's the bass going to go? It's going to resolve down to the note that it was supposed to go to the whole time, A. And if we look, we already saw it over here. A to C is a third. So even though these two notes are not attacking together, even though A is on beat 4 and C started on beat 3, remember, the tenors are still singing C. So we still get that third. We get second, first, and then a third, right? And again, the notes or the numbers in the name or the label for this, 2-3, the numbers get bigger because as the bass moves away, right, the basses are moving away from the other voices. The intervals between them get bigger, right? So it's a second, and then it's a third. In other suspensions, like the 4-3 or the 7-6, the numbers get smaller because we're measuring those distances against the bass. And so since these other suspensions happen in an upper voice, when the upper voice moves downwards, it by nature gets closer to the bass. Here the basses are the ones moving downwards, which means they are getting farther away from everybody else. So with all the voices, here is the original on the left. And here is our 2-3 suspension. Gotta love it, right? Dissonance in the bass is always really special because it has a major impacts on what goes on above it, because usually the bass is the place. The bass is the place, right? You like that? The bass is the place where we usually have the strongest formation of harmonic ideas. Okay, last thing I want to say about the 2-3 suspension is that keep in mind the same things that were important in prior suspensions are still important here. And the thing that I really want to point out is the reminder that we always want to ensure that the doubled note, that the resolution note is not doubled. That the resolution is not doubled, because we want this A that we resolve downwards to be important and to be not a surprise, but we want to withhold that note. And so when we resolve to it, we want this to be the first third of that chord in this instance that we hear. We don't want there to be another third there sort of ruining the punchline to the joke, right? It's like when you see a trailer for a movie and it kind of feels like, oh, they just gave away the big shocking surprise thing, or they just gave away the ending. That's not nearly as fun. So we want to make sure that we withhold the resolution note, that it's not doubled. Okay. Last. Oh, well, I could have. Look, it's a second and a third. Should have done that, 5 minutes ago? Okay. Let's talk about the last type of suspension here. The 9/8 suspension. Apparently, I forgot to animate that one line there. Now you know that the 9/8 suspension will have the root in the bass. It happens over root position chords. The 9/8 suspension is very unique in that it's the only one in which the resolution note will, not should, not can be, not should be, will be doubled. Can you think of why it must be doubled in a 9/8 suspension? Well, you can't have an octave. You can't have 8 if you don't have 2 of the same note, right? I can't have an octave above C unless I have 2 people singing C, right? So the 9/8 is unique in that we will definitely have a doubled note because we have that octave. Now, I personally don't like the 9/8 suspension at all. I'll just be honest. I find it not as strong as other options because of this doubled thing. Many, many people love it, among them people like J.S. Bach, but, probably not the first, probably not the last time I disagree with Bach. Sorry to say. But anyway, so let's look at the 9/8 suspension here. We're in A major. And so, coming from the key we were in on the last slide to A major. So if we go here, right, so we see that the soprano line is hanging out on B and then resolving down to A. And so here, if I just do the bass and soprano voices, we can hear this 9/8 really well. Right? See how it resolves down there? It's nice. The reason that we want to only use these 9/8 suspensions over a root position chord is that since something's going to be doubled, we might as well make sure that the thing that is doubled, the resolution note that's already present, is the root of the chord, right? In so many of these other examples, through one way or another, we ended up suspending and then resolving to the third of the chord, which is sort of a special note anyway. We want to be careful with the third in general. But with the root, that's such a solid note that it can sort of afford to have a little bit more excitement. One of the positive things about a 9/8 suspension is that since the root is going to be doubled, it means that we get dissonance with multiple notes. So A in the bass up to B in the soprano is a ninth or a second, and C sharp in the tenor up to B in the soprano is a seventh. So those 3 notes together create this gorgeous chord. So that's something to think about. And right on the beat there, it is kind of lovely. We might call that an A add 9 chord if it was just in isolation. That resolves down. So again, the 9/8 suspension can happen in any voice except the bass, right? Any voice except the bass. The basses can only do the 2/3 suspension. Any voice can do the 9/8. Though I should say, I didn't think I wrote it there. I should say, notice that this is called the 9/8 suspension, not the 2/1 suspension. This is much more effective when it truly resolves to an octave, not to a unison. So you could put a 9/8 suspension in the tenor part, for instance, but only if the basses are truly an octave below. So if we look at this bass line here, the basses are up here on G sharp, going to A, and you can kind of hear in my voice, that's getting upwards in a bass's voice. So to do a 9/8 suspension in the tenor part, for instance, they would need to be up here on this B. They'd be getting into what I, of course, affectionately call the Freddie Mercury zone. We don't want all tenors up there. Conversely, all tenors do want to be there, but it's our job as a society to keep them from going there. So we want to make sure that it's truly a 9/8 resolving to an octave, which means that to put it in the tenor voice, your basses do need to be kind of fairly low to give the tenors room to be an octave above them. But that's a subtle point. So there you go. We've got a lot of new options here in non-harmonic tone land, really enriching our musical texture, and let's keep working on them.